300,000 years ago, humanity was nothing more than fragile bands of wanderers, clinging to fire to keep the darkness away. Hunger, cold, and predators defined life. Yet from that struggle came endurance, imagination, and cooperation. The Ice Age tested us, encounters with other humans shaped us, and farming transformed us forever. This is the story of humanity's first great struggle, the Stone Age journey that decided our future. If you find this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe for more such documentaries. And tell me in the comments, which country are you watching from? The Pleistocene was a world of sharp contrasts, where survival was a daily calculation against cold, hunger, and fear. Across Africa, Europe, and Asia, small bands of early humans moved cautiously through grasslands and forests, each day uncertain whether they would live to see another sunrise. Their numbers were small, their tools crude, and their bodies no match for the predators that ruled the night. For the first time in history, survival no longer depended only on muscle or instinct. Something new was emerging, a fragile alliance between human beings and the element they learned to command: fire. Archaeological sites in East Africa tell us that humans began to control fire at least 1 million years ago, though traces at Gesher Benot Yaakov in modern-day Israel suggest the practice may go even further back. For those early groups, fire was more than a discovery. It was a boundary between life and death. Flames provided light in the hours when eyesight failed, heat in the bitter cold of Ice Age nights, and protection against animals whose senses of smell and strength had long dominated the food chain. A campfire was the first fortress of humankind, and around it, the first seeds of community were sown. To sit around fire was to do more than survive. It was to share. In its glow, meat could be cooked, making food easier to digest and safer to consume. Ashes from burned wood could be used to preserve and clean. Flames hardened spear points and opened new possibilities for hunting. But perhaps the greatest transformation was social. When darkness fell, there was little to do but gather. It was here that early humans likely exchanged stories, passed on memories, and began to construct a shared understanding of their world. The South African Cave of Wonderwerk offers evidence of this. Charred remains there indicate fires deliberately tended more than 700,000 years ago. These were not accidental blazes left by lightning strikes. They were maintained, guarded, and used. To tend fire was to tend knowledge, to ensure that one spark could be kept alive for the next day and for the next generation. In that vigilance, a new responsibility took root. Fire also shaped power within groups. Whoever controlled it held a position of importance, perhaps even reverence. The ashes of hearths became markers of territory, signs that this place is ours. Some anthropologists argue that fire itself became the first shared resource. No single person could carry it far, but together, groups ensured it never went out. The fire pit, simple as it was, may have been humanity's first institution. But even as it offered protection, fire revealed the limits of human fragility. The Ice Age climate was harsh and unstable. Shifts in temperature forced migrations, and prey animals followed unpredictable patterns. The glow of a campfire may have kept hyenas and lions at bay, but it did not guarantee food. Hunters still faced long chases with uncertain outcomes, and the weak still perished when the group could not sustain them. Fire was a tool, not a cure, archaeological. Traces from sites across Eurasia suggest that fire rituals began to take on meaning beyond survival. Burned bones placed deliberately in hearths, pigments heated for use in markings, and evidence of gatherings around flames hint at symbolic thought. To watch fire was to watch transformation, wood to ash, flesh to smoke, a reminder of both, life's warmth and its fragility. Later myths would remember this moment. The Greek legend of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods, was a cultural echo of something much older: the idea that fire set humanity apart. One anthropologist, Richard Wrangham, described this shift in simple words: cooking made us human. By softening food, Fire changed the human body itself, reducing the need for massive jaws and freeing energy for larger brains. Over millennia, these changes set the stage for language, imagination, and more complex social structures. Fire did not only protect humans from the outside world, it remade them from within. But the Ice Age was not static. Winds grew colder, glaciers advanced, and the margins of survival narrowed. Fire could ward off predators, but it could not hold back the encroaching ice. Small groups of humans found themselves pressed together in tighter spaces, relying more heavily on cooperation. Each night, as flames cracked and shadows danced against cave walls, they faced the same unspoken question. Would their fire and their fragile community last through the night? This was humanity's first trial, not the building of monuments or the creation of laws, but the simple act of keeping flame alive against the darkness. Each spark carried the promise of continuity, and each failure risked annihilation. Around those flames, our ancestors were not yet rulers of the earth. They were survivors at its margins, learning that endurance required more than strength. It required memory, imagination, and unity. And yet, the same winds that drove them to fire carried a deeper warning. The climate was shifting toward an even harsher stage, one that no single fire could resist. Ahead lay the Ice Age in its full fury, a test that would determine not only whether humans could endure, but whether they could adapt fast enough to remain at all. At the break of dawn in the Stone Age, survival began not with certainty, but with hunger. Across the grasslands of Africa and the cold steppes of Eurasia, early humans awoke with a single question that cut deeper than any spear. What would they eat today? Unlike the predators they feared, they had no claws, no fangs, no sheer speed to guarantee a kill. Survival depended instead on patience, persistence, and an increasingly sharp intelligence. Hunger was the first teacher of humanity, and the hunt was its most relentless test. Archaeological evidence from sites like Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania shows that Homo habilis, and later Homo erectus, had begun crafting stone tools specifically for cutting meat and cracking bones. These were not weapons of domination, but tools of desperation, the means to scrape marrow from carcasses left behind by stronger carnivores. At first, humans were scavengers, watching the movements of lions and hyenas, moving in only when the danger passed. But hunger does not allow stagnation. Over time, scavenging gave way to active pursuit. The hunt had begun. It was never an individual effort. To bring down an antelope or something larger like a bison required coordination. Men and women both contributed. Some flushed animals from cover, others lay in wait, and all shared the rewards. This necessity forged the beginnings of cooperation beyond blood ties. Anthropologists point to persistence hunting, chasing prey over long distances until the animal collapsed from exhaustion, as a strategy unique to humans. The prey was faster, but humans endured. They could sweat to cool their bodies, run under the punishing sun, and track across miles of open plain. Hunger taught them that victory belonged not to the strongest, but to the most relentless. Yet the risk was constant. A hunt could last days and still fail. A wounded animal could turn and kill its pursuers. Archaeological traces show broken bones, healed over time, evidence of hunters who survived injuries but carried scars that lasted a lifetime. For every successful kill, there were failures measured in gnawing stomachs and wasted strength. Famine left marks on human remains, stunted growth in children, brittle bones, and teeth worn from grinding roots and bark in desperate seasons. Women and children played their part by gathering. Wild berries, tubers, nuts, and edible leaves were essential to survival. Botanical studies of residue on Stone Age tools suggest that plants often made up the bulk of daily calories. This was not a division of labor born of inequality, but of necessity. The hunt was uncertain, but gathering ensured that a group could last until the next opportunity came. Fire, once controlled, gave an edge. Roots could be roasted, grains softened, meats made safer to consume. Each small innovation widened the fragile margin between life and death. The struggle for food also shaped how humans understood the world. Animals were not just prey, they were rivals, teachers, and sometimes symbols. Cave art from Chauvet and Lascaux, dating tens of thousands of years later, reflects the deep respect and fear early humans carried for the creatures they hunted. These were not decorations. They were records, lessons, perhaps even prayers. To depict a bison or a horse on stone was to acknowledge the delicate balance between predator and prey, and to claim, however humbly, a share of the animal's power. One striking account comes not from archaeology but from ethnography. Observations of the San people of southern Africa, whose hunting practices echo those of early humans, describe the moment of persistence hunting. The animal grows weaker with each mile, its breath heavy, its body faltering. The hunter does not stop. He runs until the earth itself seems to give way, until the prey falls not from the spear, but from exhaustion. Such hunts capture the essence of Stone Age survival, the triumph of endurance over force. But hunger was not only a daily struggle, it was a shaper of societies. Small bands of 20 to 40 people moved together, bound by need. No one could hoard fire, nor could anyone afford to withhold food. Sharing became the law of survival. Anthropologists suggest that the punishment for selfishness may have been exclusion, a death sentence in the unforgiving wild. In this way, hunger created justice long before laws were written. Still, famine remained a constant shadow. Climatic shifts could empty landscapes of game for seasons. In Europe, cold snaps wiped out herds. In Africa, droughts forced migrations across dangerous terrain. The skeletal remains of children from these times show how entire groups suffered when food ran short. To live meant to adapt, to experiment, and to push the limits of ingenuity. From hunger came invention. Spears were refined with stone tips, arrows were tested with the bow, and traps emerged as silent hunters. Each tool was a response to scarcity, a refusal to surrender to starvation. The act of eating was no longer left to chance. It became a skill, a craft, and eventually, a culture. The hunt was also a stage for resilience. Every meal was uncertain, every day another wager against nature's indifference. Yet with each passing generation, humans learned more. How to track footprints in mud, how to read broken branches, how to know which plants healed and which killed. Knowledge was survival, and survival was passed on in memory and story. Around the fire, hunger turned into history, and history turned into wisdom. The Pleistocene world never offered stability. But in hunger's shadow, early humans forged the traits that would define them: cooperation, endurance, and imagination. These were not luxuries. They were the only weapons that could keep extinction at bay. Yet as the centuries unfolded, hunger itself would be overshadowed by something greater. The world was changing. Ice was spreading across continents, reshaping landscapes and driving animals to extinction. The fire that had once guarded humanity would soon face a test far harsher than any hunt: the encroaching silence of an ice age that threatened to bury not just prey, but the fragile future of humankind itself. 25,000 years ago, the world hardened. The last glacial maximum descended, and ice claimed the northern continents. Vast sheets more than a mile thick crept across Europe, Asia, and North America, grinding valleys into existence, swallowing forests and locking rivers beneath frozen silence. The Pleistocene had always been harsh, but now it became merciless. For humanity, already living at the edge of survival, this was the ultimate trial. Archaeological evidence from mammoth hunter camps in Ukraine and Siberia shows just how inventive humans became in the face of such cold. Animal bones were not only food but building material. Mammoth tusks and ribs formed the frameworks of shelters, their hides stretched to block the wind. Fire pits, lined with stone, burned constantly, fueled by scavenged wood and animal fat. In temperatures that plunged to -20 degrees Celsius, fire became less a tool than a heartbeat. Its loss meant death within hours. The landscape itself turned hostile. Grasslands shrank, forests disappeared, and herds migrated to narrower corridors. Some animals, like the woolly rhinoceros and giant deer, endured the cold for a time, but many vanished. Scarcity turned the hunt into a desperate gamble. At Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, archaeologists uncovered thousands of animal bones scattered across the remains of shelters, a sign of both survival and slaughter. But alongside those bones lay fragments of fired clay, figurines, the oldest known ceramics. Even in this trial, humans were not only surviving, they were creating. For Neanderthals, the Ice Age was even harsher. Adapted to cold with stocky bodies and strong limbs, they had thrived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. Yet when the climate reached its most punishing extremes, their small groups and limited networks left them vulnerable. Homo sapiens, by contrast, maintained wider alliances. Archaeological DNA evidence suggests groups exchanged members across regions, creating bonds that stretched beyond kinship. This broader web of support allowed sapiens to survive what Neanderthals could. Not daily life was defined by caution and endurance. In caves at Chauvet and Altamira, humans painted images of lions, mammoths, and bison, not as idle decoration, but as echoes of a world they longed to endure within. Scholars debate their purpose, perhaps ritual for the hunt, perhaps memory, of animals already disappearing. Either way, these images were a refusal to surrender meaning in a world stripped bare by ice. The cold also demanded new technologies. Stone blades became sharper and more specialized. Bone and antler were carved into needles, used to stitch together furs into tight, layered clothing. Without tailored garments, survival in open tundra would have been impossible. The sewing needle, simple yet revolutionary, may have been one of the greatest weapons of the Ice Age, but even innovation carried risks. Hunting mammoth or bison required cooperation on a scale larger than before. Whole groups worked to trap animals near cliffs or marshes, risking their own lives against beasts weighing several tons. Evidence from La Côte de Saint-Brelade on the Eichem island of Jersey suggests Neanderthals and early sapiens may have driven mammoths over cliffs, sacrificing some of their hunters in the chaos to ensure food for months. The Ice Age made such risks necessary. Hunger left no choice, and yet death was never far. Skeletons from Ice Age burials reveal trauma from both hunting accidents and conflict. As resources tightened, groups may have clashed not only with animals, but with each other. A fractured skull or a stone point embedded in bone tells the story of humans turned against humans under pressure. The Ice Age tested not only survival against nature, but survival against rivals. The human cost was staggering, but resilience was greater. Burials like those at Sungir in Russia show that even in the coldest depths of hardship, humans laid their dead to rest with beads, ivory pendants, and ochre. This was more than grief. It was testimony that meaning could survive alongside hunger, that even in shadows, humanity carried light. One archaeologist studying Sungir put it this way: they had nothing, yet they gave everything. The dead were adorned not because it was practical, but because it was human. The Ice Age had forced humanity to the brink, but it also clarified what could not be surrendered: memory, ritual, and the sense that life carried value even in the harshest conditions. Still, the glaciers continued to expand. Valleys filled with ice, seas receded, and landscapes transformed beyond recognition. For every group that adapted, another vanished. Some humans retreated to warmer refuges in southern Europe, the Levant, and Africa. These refugees became crucibles where small populations endured, exchanged knowledge, and prepared for the slow thaw that would reshape the earth once more. As centuries passed, the ice reached its peak, and then, slowly, began to recede. Temperatures, Inched upward, rivers unfroze and grasslands spread again. Yet the trial left its mark. Entire species, mammoths in some regions, cave lions, giant ground sloths, were gone. Humans had survived, but they inherited a quieter, emptier world. The last glacial maximum was not only a geological event, it was humanity's crucible. It forced adaptation at every level, in body, in technology, in society, and in imagination. Those who endured carried forward the lessons carved into their bones, that survival was not strength alone, but ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience. But survival was not the end. As the ice retreated, Homo sapiens would step into a new chapter of history, one defined not only by the cold, but by encounters with other humans, kin and rivals, who had walked this earth long before. The shadows of ice were fading, but ahead lay confrontation with those who mirrored us most closely, and whose disappearance would mark another irreversible turning point in the story of humankind. As the ice began its slow retreat, Homo sapiens walked a world already inhabited by others. We were not alone. Across Europe, Asia, and beyond lived other species of the human family, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and remnants of earlier lineages, that had adapted to their own landscapes long before sapiens arrived. For tens of thousands of years, this planet was not the home of one humanity, but of many. To understand our survival, we must confront the truth that our ancestors lived alongside cousins who were strong, intelligent, and deeply human in their own right. The most familiar of these were the Neanderthals, stocky, powerful, and adapted. To the cold climates of Ice Age Europe, they had thrived for more than 300,000 years. Archaeological sites from Shanidar Cave in Iraq to La Chapelle aux Saints in France reveal a people capable of remarkable care. At Shanidar, one skeleton shows signs of crippling injuries sustained in life. Yet the individual survived for years, evidence that others must have fed and protected him. These were not brutes, but humans who valued kinship and compassion. In Asia, another branch emerged. The Denisovans, known today only through fragments of bone and teeth discovered in a Siberian cave. Their DNA tells a larger story. Genetic analysis shows that Denisovans interbred with both Neanderthals and sapiens, leaving traces still present in modern populations from East Asia to Oceania. The invisible map written in our genes is testimony that our survival was not simply a story of replacement, but also of mingling. Encounters were complex. Some were violent, as groups competed for hunting grounds, caves, and scarce resources, but others were intimate. The sequencing of ancient genomes proves that sapiens and Neanderthals shared more than weapons and tools. They shared lives, children, and families. Today, between 1% and 4% of the DNA of people of European and Asian descent comes from Neanderthals. Among indigenous populations of Australia and Melanesia, Denisovan DNA runs even deeper. The evidence is clear. They are not gone entirely. They live, in part, through us. And yet, by 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. Denisovans vanished into silence soon after. Why did sapiens endure when others did not? Archaeology suggests the answer lies not in strength, but in imagination. Neanderthal groups were skilled hunters, but they lived in smaller bands, rarely numbering more than a few dozen. Homo sapiens, by contrast, learned to build networks that stretched across vast regions. Shared myths, symbols, and rituals bound together strangers who had never met, enabling cooperation on a scale that no other human species matched. The caves of Chauvet and El Castillo, painted with herds of animals and mysterious signs, reflect more than art. They reveal communication that transcended individuals. A mark on stone could carry meaning beyond the lifetime of its maker. This symbolic thinking allowed sapiens to coordinate hunts, exchange resources, and form alliances across hundreds of miles. Where Neanderthals depended on close kin, sapiens built communities of the mind. In a world of shifting climate and scarce prey, That difference proved decisive. Still, the Neanderthals were not without culture. They made tools as sophisticated as sapiens, wore ornaments, and may have buried their dead with ritual. In 2018, researchers confirmed that cave markings in Spain, older than 60,000 years, were the work of Neanderthals. Red ochre symbols painted on stone walls, silent voices reaching across time. They too imagined. They too remembered. Their disappearance remains one of history's greatest questions, but it was not the fall of a primitive people before progress. It was the vanishing of equals, a narrowing of human possibility. Neanderthals were not inferior, one paleoanthropologist observed. They were different. Their fate was a matter of circumstance, not destiny. Perhaps their smaller populations left them vulnerable to disease. Perhaps interbreeding with sapiens absorbed them into us. Perhaps the sudden swings of Ice Age climate cut away their refuges. Whatever the cause, by the time the Ice Age gave way, Homo sapiens stood alone. Yet traces of those encounters lingered in memory. Myths of giants, forest dwellers, and half-human beings appear in later cultures across Eurasia. They may be echoes of the time when humans knew there were others, beings close enough to resemble us, yet distinct enough to remind us of our fragile uniqueness. The presence of the other human left an imprint not only in our genes, but in our imagination. The disappearance of our cousins was more than extinction. It was a turning point. With their loss, sapiens inherited the world entire, bearing both the privilege and the burden of survival. For the first time, our species stood without rival, but the lessons of those encounters endured. That survival was never guaranteed, that kinship could extend across difference, and that memory itself carried power. As glaciers withdrew and landscapes opened, sapiens began to spread farther still. From Europe to the coasts of Asia, across land bridges into Australia and the Americas, humans pressed outward into every corner of the globe. But in each step forward, the shadow of the past followed. The knowledge that once we were many, and that our survival had come at the cost of others like us. The Stone Age was no longer simply a struggle against hunger and cold. It had become a reckoning with identity, with what it meant to be human, and what was lost when others like us vanished. Ahead lay a new revolution, born not of hunting or survival, but of seeds planted in the earth. The next trial would not be endurance in the wild, but permanence in the soil. When the Ice Age loosened its grip, the land itself changed. Glaciers melted, rivers swelled, and grasslands unfurled across regions once buried under ice. For millennia, humans had lived as wanderers, tethered to the migrations of animals and the rhythms of wild plants. But as climate stabilized and fertile ground emerged, a quiet revolution began. Instead of chasing food, humans learned to make it. The Stone Age, defined by the hunt, was giving way to something entirely new. Archaeological discoveries in the Fertile Crescent, stretching from modern-day Iraq through Syria, Turkey, and into the Levant, show the first steps toward cultivation. Around 12,000 years ago, groups began to gather wild cereals like wheat and barley, not only for immediate consumption, but for planting. Grinding stones, sickles, and storage pits uncovered at sites like Jericho and Sayonu reveal a shift. In thinking, food was no longer only for today. It could be saved, multiplied, and controlled. This transformation did not happen overnight. For thousands of years, communities experimented with both foraging and cultivation. They herded goats, sheep, and cattle not only for meat, but for milk, hides, and labor. Fire, once used to shape landscapes for hunting, was turned to clear fields for crops. The domestication of plants and animals was gradual, born from necessity and opportunity. Yet its consequences were profound. With farming came permanence. Villages grew around fertile soil, their houses of mud and stone arranged in clusters. Jericho, one of the world's oldest known settlements, rose around 10,000 years ago with walls and towers that hinted at new concerns: defense, ownership, and inequality. Where once humans moved lightly across landscapes, now they anchored themselves to them. Fields had to be defended. Surplus had to be stored. Society itself was being reshaped by the weight of grain. The agricultural revolution was not only progress, it carried burdens that hunter-gatherers had rarely known. Crops could fail under drought or flood, and reliance on a single food source risked malnutrition. Burials from early farming villages show signs of disease and stunted growth, evidence that sedentary life brought new hardships. Hierarchies emerged. With surplus came power. Those who controlled storage pits or herds controlled the fate of others. Inequality, once impossible in small nomadic bands, became part of human life. Still, the shift was irreversible. Seeds bound humans to soil, and soil bound them to each other. Population grew, fueled by stable food supplies. Villages became towns. Towns became centers of trade, and from trade came networks that stretched across continents. Farming did more than feed. It created culture, permanence, and eventually, civilization. Symbols reflected the transformation. At Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey, wall paintings and shrines suggest the birth of shared rituals tied to fertility, harvest, and protection of the land. Grain became not just sustenance, but sacred, its cycles of growth and death woven into myth. What had begun as survival became meaning, yet the cost was heavy. Forests were cleared, wild species dwindled, and human footprints pressed deeper into landscapes than ever before. The same ingenuity that once enabled survival now carried the power to reshape ecosystems entirely. Some scholars call this the beginning of humanity's uneasy mastery over nature, a mastery built as much on destruction as on cultivation. The seeds of a new world carried both promise and peril. They gave stability, but demanded labor, created abundance but deepened inequality, and offered permanence but limited freedom. For better or worse, humanity had crossed a threshold. The trial of the hunt was ending. A new trial of ownership, hierarchy, and civilization was beginning. The Stone Age was drawing to a close, not because humans abandoned stone tools, but because they had found something even sharper: the ability to shape landscapes, societies, and destinies. Farming was the end of one kind of survival and the beginning of another. As the first cities flickered into existence, humanity's story entered an age defined not by fire and the hunt, but by walls, harvests, and rule. The next great challenge was not how to endure the wilderness, but how to endure ourselves. The Stone Age did not vanish in an instant. Even as villages rose and crops took root, stone tools remained the daily instruments of survival. Flint blades still cut meat, bone awls still stitched hides, and fire still glowed at the heart of every home. For thousands of years, farming communities and nomadic hunters coexisted, their worlds overlapping on shifting frontiers. The Age of Stone endured, but its echoes were fading. At sites like Çatalhöyük in Anatolia and Jericho in the Levant, archaeologists uncover a dual world: farmers cultivating wheat and barley, while hunters still returned with gazelle, deer, and boar. Transition was never uniform. In Europe, Asia, and Africa, foraging remained a lifeway long after agriculture began. Some groups resisted farming altogether, valuing mobility over fields. Others blended the two, gathering wild foods to supplement harvests. The Stone Age was not erased. It was transformed, but permanence brought change that could not be reversed. Settlements expanded. Clay replaced hide and bone. Pottery emerged, fragile yet enduring, carrying traces of meals eaten thousands of years ago. With it came storage, trade, and the ability to transport goods across distances. Where stone tools once defined humanity, now new materials, clay, bone, obsidian, revealed a world diversifying beyond the simplicity of the hunt. Burials from this period tell a story of deepening complexity. Graves in farming villages often contain beads, ornaments, and symbols of status. Inequality, invisible in the archaeological record of earlier hunter-gatherers, became a defining mark of settled life. Some were buried with wealth, others with little more than their bodies. The echoes of the Stone Age, with its small, egalitarian bands, grew fainter as hierarchy spread. Yet the memory of wandering remained. In the mythology of later civilizations, the contrast is clear. Ancient texts describe golden ages of simplicity, when humans lived close to nature before the burden of toil. These stories may carry whispers of the Stone Age, preserved in memory as both loss and nostalgia. Farming offered abundance, but it demanded ceaseless labor. For the first time, humanity's greatest trial was no longer the wilderness, but the weight of its own creations. Technological shifts mirrored this transformation. Around 6,000 years ago, metallurgy began to emerge in parts of the Near East. Copper tools appeared alongside stone axes. For centuries, the two existed together, stone by tradition, metal by innovation. The Stone Age lingered, but its supremacy was slipping. Each new material carried new possibilities, and each possibility carried change that no one could fully control. Still, for countless communities across Africa, Australia, and the Americas, the Stone Age remained a living reality for much longer. Their resilience proved that no single timeline defines humanity. Even as empires rose elsewhere, hunters and gatherers continued to thrive in ways that echoed the earliest ancestors. The end of the Stone Age was not a single moment in time, but a mosaic of endings, each shaped by geography, climate, and choice. What, then, was lost when the Stone Age faded? Freedom of movement, perhaps. A life where survival was harsh, yet bound by shared struggle rather than hierarchy. What was gained was permanence, stability, population growth, and the first sparks of civilization. In that balance lay the foundations of human destiny, the ability to create, but also the power to destroy. Historians often describe this as humanity's first great transformation, the shift from foraging to farming, from wandering to settlement, from equality to stratification. Yet beneath the changes, one constant remained. Fire still burned. It had carried humanity through hunger, through ice, and through encounters with other humans. It burned still at the hearths of farmers, linking them to ancestors who once huddled in caves. The Stone Age was not simply an era of tools, it was the crucible of identity. Here, humanity endured trials of hunger, cold, and competition. Here, we learned endurance, cooperation, and imagination. And when its echoes finally faded, they left behind lessons that shaped every age to come. That survival requires adaptation, that power must be tempered by memory, and that progress carries both promise and peril. The last echo of the Stone Age was not silence. It was continuity, a reminder that the foundations of civilization were laid by those who carved flint, kindled fire, and kept one another alive against the night. Everything that followed, cities, empires, nations, rested on the resilience forged in that age. Humanity's final trial of stone had ended, but its legacy would define us forever. That's it for today. Subscribe for more, and drop your country's name in the comments.